So good morning. I am going to actually just turn the microphone over to Nate Cohen so that he can introduce our illustrious panel, and we will get started. But I have to tell you, this year, probably for the first time, I'm going to try to attend all of the panels, and I know some of you have been doing that for probably 16 years. And so I thank you for getting up early in the morning to be here. But, you know, this morning, it's a treat for me as well, because just look who's up here. And first, let me just introduce the festival director, Nate Cohen.
I don't think Patton Oswalt is going to be able to be with us this morning. He's not a morning person. We made him get up at 8 o'clock yesterday, so I thought Chaz might sit in his chair so that you're responsible for the humor. Okay.
Okay, where's my name tag?
You don't, Chaz, you don't need a name tag.
I'll be Patton this morning.
Okay. The title of this panel is Reimagining Filmmaking for the Digital Age. Half the people you see on this panel came up to me and said, what's that all about? I don't know anything about that. And so I started thinking about how I came up with a name for the panel, and I sort of drew a blank. I like, you know, if you put the word digital in anything, it's supposed to mean it's good or interesting or fantastic. And I like the word reimagining because it's just a nice word. But those of you who have been with us in the past know that the titles of these panels actually mean very little, and people just talk about whatever they want to talk about. And that's what we like about the sort of informality of how these are structured. But, you know, the digital age has affected the entire process of filmmaking, from the way scripts are written, to the way they're shot, to the way they're edited, to the way they're distributed, to the way they're written about, and the way and the way critics and theorists analyze them and tell us what we've missed, because we're not experts like they are. I'm not talking about David Bordwell in particular, but so we have on our panel here Brie Larson, who you saw in the previous panel, the star of Short Term 12, Haifa Al-Mansour, whose film Wadja is going to be showing on Saturday, and she's come all the way from Bahrain to be with us. Barry Allen is recently retired from Paramount Pictures. He now lives in Indianapolis, and I got to know Barry over the years when Roger always insisted that we get the best possible prints to show at the festival, archival prints if at all possible, restored prints. And Barry Allen, for many, many years, was absolutely instrumental in making sure that the Paramount Library was kept pristine, up to date, and he's been a great help to the festival throughout its entire existence. So I asked him to drive over from Indianapolis, and he's here today. David Bordwell, most of you know. I don't know what else to say about Dave. He lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and for that he deserves a lot of praise. But he is the foremost film theorist out there at the moment, and has been for a long time. And he and Roger were very, very, very close friends. Steve James, you saw his film last night, the director of Life Itself. Jem Cohen, whose film what's the name? Oh, Museum Hours. We'll be showing at 1 o'clock today, and it's a beautiful, lyrical, amazing piece of work. George Nicholas is from the public relations firm, the entertainment public relations firm PMK in New York, and he is working with us this year to make sure the word gets out about Ebertfest. And then Patton Oswald is there. So let's, perhaps David, you could start us off talking a little bit about, I'd like everybody to consider the idea of how the digital revolution has affected how you do your work. And we have people here who've worked in every aspect of the industry. So maybe, David, you could give us a little overview of a little history of what's happened in filmmaking in writing about film since the computer came into existence in about 30 seconds.
Well, in terms of how I do my work, and Kristen and I work together on these kinds of projects, we're researchers, and so for a long time, even before the age of home video, we had to travel to archives to see films, to see various versions of films that were stored in places like the Library of Congress or UCLA or George Eastman House. And that's a time-consuming and effortful task. And certainly the rise of home video with VHS and beta tape, and then eventually the DVD, meant that certain kinds of research questions that we wanted to ask could be answered in a much more convenient way. Not every research question, but some. And then what I've watched happen over the years has been this sort of, as Nate mentioned, this kind of gradual encroachment of the digital methods and digital technology across all the different phases of filmmaking. So it isn't just the possibility of seeing films on, small format discs, but rather the entirety of the filmmaking process, what's now called the workflow, I guess, as well as distribution and exhibition. So that's an enormous change, in my opinion. Looking at somebody who looks at movies, my sense was for a time that the digital and the analog could coexist, that the analogy I like to draw then was, just as we have painting and we have etching, say, or woodblock prints, they're both perfectly legitimate forms of artistic expression and imagery. Why couldn't we have both film and video, various forms of video, coexisting? And that didn't happen. I mean, clearly what happened was something bigger called digital cinema took over all the phases of production and distribution and exhibition, as well as the artifact itself. So that now making a film on film is comparatively rare for both professionals and semi-professionals, and certainly for consumers, but also consuming a film as a 35 millimeter or 16 millimeter print is also very, very unusual. So there's a sense in which we only have etchings, if you like, rather than paintings. There's so much to say about this, I don't want to just babble on, but one thing that does strike me is that in some ways the digital revolution has been exaggerated, in the sense that many of the things that digital production does were possible with analog production. But digital makes a kind of quantitative leap and makes it much easier and more efficient, and in some respects, though I guess not all, cheaper. So there's a way in which, at the level of production, digital is a kind of an efficient substitute, if you like, for certain aspects of film, certain aspects. However, for me, the most important consequence of what Nate was calling the digital revolution has been distribution and exhibition. Those really have been immensely important and quite different in many respects. Shipping a film print is quite different from sending a movie out on a hard drive. And certainly the projection of films on essentially computers with light bulbs inside, rather than in 35 millimeter projectors, have a lot of consequences for the way movies are going to be seen and distributed in the future. For one thing, a computer with a light bulb inside is like any other computer. It goes down about every 5 years or 6 years. You have to replace it. And that wasn't the case with a 35 millimeter projector. So for me, the most consequential changes take place in distribution and exhibition. But of course, there are aesthetic aspects to video that are very important in production as well.
Okay, thank you. Haifa, has the digital revolution reached the Middle East?
Oh yeah, big time. I think the most important thing, we are not talking about distribution when it comes to the Middle East, because I think it's still the cinema industry, and it is only in Egypt mainly, which they have, like it's the Hollywood of the Middle East. They still very, they use old projections from the 70s, so they have a long time to go. But I think it gave a lot of young people in the Middle East the chance for their voices to be heard. Like it is a very cheap technology and accessible. So we started hearing from a lot of filmmakers who don't have a lot of money but still have vision, and they challenge their situation. So we see a lot of interesting short films and documentaries coming from places like Saudi Arabia, where people, it's very censored, and access to information. We have a lot of, it's not open as before, but it's not as close as before, but still it's very controlled, and it made a lot of young people make really amazing films about their life and what they see, and go outside, and we have film festivals like in Dubai or places like that, and always filmmakers coming from places like this. They have a lot of merit because they talk about social and political issues from an everyday perspective. And in that way, I think the digital era affected the Middle East deeply, and is helping democracy find roots, not in big term revolutions, as much as giving people the voices and have them, especially young people and women, where traditionally are not heard, have this kind of existence. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's. Let's talk to perhaps Jem. Do you want to talk a little bit? Do you work in digital?
Well, the film that I'm showing here today was shot half and half. I shot the exteriors in Super 16 and the interiors digitally. But I come from a film background, and we were briefly talking outside about it. As a filmmaker, I think there's something to be said for starting out in an environment where the material itself was very precious, and so it kind of forces you to think carefully about what you do, because it costs so much. So there was a kind of an inherent sense of discipline, sometimes bordering on terror, that that you didn't want to waste the material. And so I think in a way maybe that was good, just to be always sort of thinking that you wanted it to count. But then, I've also always come from a very low budget kind of do-it-yourself place, and I don't have the luxury to be a purist about it, and so I always kind of believe that you make the movies that you can make, however you can make them, and so in some respects I'm thankful that I can do things entirely on my own that I couldn't when I was cutting film. But I think that maybe the way that it's affected me the most is that the digital world that we're in and kind of inundated by, it sort of seems like everybody's a little freaked out by it. I mean, everybody has all these devices, and everybody's kind of constantly talking about how everything's speeding up. So for me, the important thing really isn't necessarily the format, but kind of a mentality where you think about, I think my response to this kind of acceleration, which I think for many humans is a very uncomfortable and problematic thing, is that to think that, it might be nice if movies were not just going to ride with that and gather the same kind of out of control speed and feeling, but maybe movies even more need to be a counterforce, where they are a place in which people are not distracted and have a kind of thoughtful, contemplative realm, and getting people into a theater where they're going to sit and deal with something in the dark for an hour and a half or 2 hours together is actually very potent in the digital realm, where people are so used to watching movies in little bits and pieces on little tiny devices.
So movies as an escape from the tyranny of the digital world.
I mean, as a coping mechanism, not necessarily as an escape, but as a way to reflect on it. It's like I mean, the fear to me with the digital age, to just jump on what you're talking about, is that then the movie theater is slowly going to be phased out by this intense need to have everything that we want now, right in a certain moment. And I see it a lot with, I have a younger sister, and it's all about, like, there's a whole world in texting that I just personally don't understand, that, like, everyone's just, like, in this thing, and if you don't respond in a certain amount of time, then it means things, and there's this whole other secret world that's happening. And so I think you're absolutely right. Like, regardless of whether we keep moving towards digital or film gets lost, which I do hope won't happen, but I guess things always change, it ultimately, I think, comes down to giving people the opportunity to slow down and have some sort of empathy and meditation. The digital age is fearful to me because it's like, you know, robots and no emotion and just everything, and we'll all just never leave the house and only talk through computers. And so to have that moment when we're all just like this, kind of sitting in a room and discussing and feeling, and I mean, the storytelling medium is what we know of the past. It's how we can relate ourselves to the past. It's myth. It's what we used to tell around campfires. So to be able to get back to that, I think, is where the real essence of it is.
Mm-hmm. And as you all know, that's one of the first things that we decided when we put this festival together, was that we're going to show the films one at a time so everyone can see all the films together. And we so, you know, if you're sitting in a movie with someone, you know, you both have chosen to go to that movie, so you have something in common, and there's a potential for conversation, for friendship, and for all kinds of other things. Let's get a little more tech. I want to talk. So George and Chaz, I'm going to ask you a little bit to talk about how the digital world has affected how you do your jobs, how you promote films, how you write about films. Chaz has a company called Ebert Digital, so be thinking about that. But Barry, talk a little bit about what's happening within the studio system in terms of film versus digital through distribution, the restoration of classic films. Do we have things we should be afraid of going on out there?
Yeah, I think there's a great risk that the most important element in preservation is film stock, because I've always said this, and I'll keep saying it until they bury me. If it's not out to film, even if it's born digital, it's not preserved. Now, we may lose that ability to do that very soon. The whole shift away from release prints happened almost overnight. I didn't think it would happen that fast, but a lot of things happen very quickly. And I'd say make digital, but try to make film also. I realize that's up front, it's much more expensive. Long term, making film properly and putting it in a proper environment for storage requires very little maintenance over a century. Digital right now, they predict that it's going to be terribly expensive to maintain something for 100 years. So a lot of things somewhere down the road, in 15 or 20 years, they may say, we've got too many things out there to justify keeping all of them. With film, 10,000 feet, 2 stacks of cans like this, stored environmentally with all the bells and whistles, which actually are very simple, just the proper temperature and humidity and the proper storage device to allow the film to breathe. Film needs to breathe. On the positive side, and I think generally digital has brought some things to us that I want you to consider. I've been able to repair films. My use of it was entirely in the realm of repairing films that we were restoring photochemically. So we had a little photo-digital too, because we couldn't do certain things photochemically. Sometimes you could fix a damaged section of film, a very bad tear or stains, by finding an alternate element. Sometimes that isn't there. And except in the most extreme cases of damage and deterioration, you can use powerful digital tools to bring it back to match the footage before and after. It's expensive, it's time consuming, but what you get out of that, particularly if you do it 4K, and 2K works quite well with older films, you get film back to be part of your total preservation of that, that movie. And it was a godsend, because often before we had tools like that, and that hasn't been very long. That's just, I mean, the whole preservation concept of trying to preserve films and make something viewable that represented the original look of the film. Sometimes that's difficult because people invariably differ a great deal on what the original look was, and prints are not always a guide. That's a whole discussion.
I think, Barry, weren't you responsible for the print we saw last year of Days of Heaven, the Terrence Malick film?
If it looked good, it was probably one of the 2 test prints I made, one from the original negative when we were timing an IP for Terry to do the HD, and the other one was a preservation, made from a preservation negative to test its comparison with the off the original.
Yeah.
So you probably got one of those.
It was extraordinary. Steve, you worked in both film and digital. Has it affected how you shoot films? I know some documentary filmmakers I've talked to, like Jem I was talking to, prefer film because it limits them. You know, it says, I'd still be shooting this film if I had shot it on digital, 5 years later.
Well, I've only done one documentary since I've been out of school on film, and it was the one that I got the least funding for, so go figure on that. But
Which one?
Stevie. And the reason I shot it on film was because I started to make it as a little short film, and then it grew into something more than that. But I ended up deciding that we'd try to figure a way to keep shooting on film, because given the nature of the story, it felt like I didn't want to do it so much because I loved the look of film better, which I do and did, but it was more because the nature of the story, it felt like if it was on film, it might lend it more gravitas in a way, in terms of the viewer experience of it, even though you may not be aware. Most viewers don't really watch films, and especially now with the advances in HD technology, many of us don't watch them and go, oh, that's on film, that's on digital. But when this film was made, there was enough of a difference that it being on film, I felt like it gave more to the story in a way. But the truth is, like Gemma said, it's like without digital technology, I couldn't have done most of the films that I've done, quote unquote, that I've done, because they just would not be affordable in the way that I work, the kind of films that I've done where I follow people for a period of time and shoot lots of hours.
I just could not have done them. It really has democratized the process. It's made it possible for people to make films. When I started, you had to know somebody with a really expensive video camera if you weren't going to shoot film, because we didn't have the money. You had to know somebody that had like a $60,000 video camera to just get broadcast quality video. You had to know someone who had a place to go edit, analog editing in video, which was just a nightmare. But you just couldn't do it. Now people can do that, and I think there is great value in that. There's a bit of loss of community in terms of filmmaking with that, I think, that comes with that. But I think the thing about any new technology, in my view, it's not so much that it completely supplants the old one. When television came in, they thought it would be the end of radio. They thought it would be the end of film, too. And it wasn't. And I think the actual physical film itself as a part of the process, yes, is probably going away. But I think at its heart, its essential essence, I don't think is going away soon. I do think, like Bree was saying, it's like this communal experience that you have, like at this festival and other festivals. I think that's going to become more and more precious. I think film festivals are going to, frankly, be going forward. They're going to be the place where people go for that experience, and it's going to become a more unique experience, except when you go see tentpole, huge Hollywood movies where people want to see them, not so much because they want to see them with other people, but because they want that massive experience of the film itself. And so I think that's why film festivals are absolutely more and more vital, and to preserving that communal filmmaking experience, especially for films like the ones we make, which are not, Gravity, at least not yet, maybe some of you. But I think that's going to be essential and important, because every filmmaker wants that experience of their work with an audience. But, and I'll say one other thing real quick, I also think, though, that one of the things that digital technology is doing, which is actually quite exciting, it's just the viewing part of it is where it becomes more problematic, is it's actually opening up in the world of documentary, I can say this at least, it's opening up some very interesting new ways to tell stories. If you go online and if you Google it, you can find this. I'll just mention two examples. One's called Pine Point, and the other one's called High Rise. And these are documentaries of a sort that are completely nonlinear. They are very democratic in terms of the process of you experiencing them. You decide how you want to experience them. So, for instance, High Rise is a documentary in which they create this sort of fictitious high-rise that each apartment is like an apartment from a high-rise somewhere around the world. So it's sort of like this UN of high-rises. And you can go through and meet the people that live in each of those apartments. You can go into their environment and click on something in their environment and learn something about that. It brings photography into it in a way that photography is sort of threatened in photojournalism, I think. It really is quite extraordinary. And it's a completely different way of telling stories. The danger for me, when I look at that, is I think it's great. The problem with it is you're watching it on your computer, number one, and they need to create a technology that once you start with it, you can't be texting. You can't stop and go check your email. Like, you're in, kind of like the equivalent of here. You bar the door and you have to do it. They're not going to come up with that, but that's the danger of it, because it's exciting and creative and fabulous, but it's so easily distractible.
We gave a Peabody Award this year to High Rise, because it is extraordinary. It's a partnership, I believe, between the Film Board of Canada and the New York Times, which is an interesting partnership in and of itself.
Yeah, National Film Board is one of they're involved with Pine Point. A lot of these really innovative ones they're a part of. There
is another one that we also gave a Peabody Award to called Hollow, HOLLOW. It's hollow documentary.com. You have to watch it with Chrome, the Chrome browser for some reason because it doesn't work anywhere else, but it is an extraordinary examination of Appalachia and in a small town in West Virginia. But it's a similar sort of nonlinear kind of experience.
Yeah, it's kind of extending this democratic notion of what digital has brought to the viewer, which is
Yeah.
really kind of interesting.
The problem is, how do we show something like that at a film festival?
Yeah.
Chaz, as you know, Roger embraced new technology faster and with more enthusiasm than most anybody in the world. How is this, and you two have, with Ebert Digital, are moving in all kinds of new directions with film criticism. Maybe talk a little bit about what you're doing.
I do embrace technological advances, but at the same time, you know that to me, the human spirit is the reason that we're on this earth and the reason that we live. So I embrace connection. The thing that I think we lose with some digital technology, even though it's gotten better, is I still think that the emotional connection to the film and to the characters is not as rich with digital projection as it is with, film, celluloid. Our brain, we actually use different parts of our brain to access watching something digitally projected as we do watching something on film. The movement of our eyes, there have been studies about eye movement. Eye movement is different when you're watching digital projection as opposed to film projection. At one time, Roger embraced something called Maxivision, which was instead of projecting something at 24 frames per second, it was projected at 48 frames per second, which gave you that increased intensity that you can sometimes get with in digital projection, but you still have the film, you're still using film. That was abandoned because the digital projection technology was also advancing, and in some instances it became a more democratic process for filmmakers, just like like Jim and Steve, who are actually making films. You want something that is affordable for, especially for talented filmmakers, because even though something is cheaper and more accessible, it doesn't mean the product is going to be better. You can have everybody, we can give everybody in here a pencil, and we have access to the same 26 letters of the alphabet. But when if we give a writing assignment, how many are going to produce something that's Shakespearean, and how many will, produce Beavis and Butthead? So it doesn't mean, so it's not just the means of production, it's also the talent. You still have to have the talent, you still have to have the writing ability, you still have to have the empathy. And I think that empathy is actually projected better on film than digital, even though it's getting better. It does make, and yet I'm also a techie. I love technological advances, but I like it when it's not an either or. I'm not a person who thinks that if we have a technological advance, it's going to obliterate, civilization as we know it. But I do think that there are, for instance, I'm tremendously excited about what Steve just said. First thing I want to do is go watch High Rise to see how someone took digital projection and used it in a very innovative way and in a way that's sort of exciting, something that we didn't think about. One of the things that I would like to do for this film festival as we move forward is still have the commitment to projecting as many things as we can on film when we can get film. Sometimes it's going to be more difficult. There was a 35 millimeter film festival that really, it just ended and there was a theater that used to show 35 millimeter films all the time. It was shuttered because they didn't have They won't have everything in the pipeline. So I want to find and make, we're contacting archival places, because even 70 millimeter is so important to me. When we showed Playtime. Tati's Playtime on 70 millimeter, I don't know how many of you were here. You saw things in the corner of screens, you saw things that the people were doing in the background. The color saturation is so beautiful. Black and white on film is astonishing. You just see things that you don't see, but I have to tell you, digital projection is getting a lot better. But I can, from the perspective of having film critics who have to write and get their copy in, when I go to film screenings, the projectionist, the lost art of the projectionist, we have a projectionist in Chicago, Steve Krause, who used to come and work here at Ebert Fest also. He's one of the best projectionists around. A lot of they used to have a projectionist for to show each film. Then they put like one person with digital, and he had to run like maybe 6 or 8 multiplex things. Things were breaking down. They have key systems. They have all kind of things that a lot of the projectionists were not really trained for. That's getting better. It's still a problem. Sometimes you go to a movie, and before you were, maybe you don't have to worry about it being projected in the wrong aspect ratio as much as you did before, but there are still problems with digital projection that you don't see. And then it's the problem of preservation that I love that Barry and Martin Scorsese and all of these people who are really concerned with film preservation. That's really important. It's just something important to me. The other thing that and I'm sorry because I do have a lot to say on this, and I'm going to stop because I know we have a big panel. I was concerned at first, like I said, I love technology, but I was concerned that young people who are watching, you just can't watch a movie like Gravity on your iPhone. And some people try, but I think that you miss a lot of things. I also like the community that I think Bree spoke about, the community of watching films. That's another reason we'll continue to have Ebert Fest, to have film festivals, because I think watching in the community is important. It's a socialization process. And when you're used to watching something digital on a small device, you forget that you have to learn manners. You can't, get up and, leave to go talk to your friends or stand up, or a lot of things that you do that I really do think little tiny ways the eroding of civilization. So anyway, it's
the Virginia Theater has just gotten a state-of-the-art digital projection. Luckily, and this goes back to the building of the theater. When they built the projection booth at the Virginia Theater, they effectively built it around 2 70 millimeter, 35 millimeter Norelco projectors. So when they shut down the Virginia before we went in and helped them remodel it, they couldn't get the projectors out. So they just left them there. And then we refurbished them, and whenever we can, as Chaz says, we always show a print over a digital print. Yeah, Jim.
Well, I just want to say, I've been to a number of panels where some of these things are discussed, and I very much appreciate this, Barry talking about and Chaz talking about preservation. But I think there's kind of an elephant in the room, which is that it's brought up. All the archivists I know that this is the status quo right now, that preservation of digital is a nightmare, and it's not being dealt with. I mean, I would love to have my films output as film. Most of them were shot on film, but we're talking $25,000, $30,000 for that film
Easily.
Print, that single preservation print. I can't do it. It's not something that I can have as an option. But I'm deeply concerned about the fact that when you go to the movies, you're watching now a hard drive. Well, most hard drives that we deal with, put them on a shelf for 5 years, take them off the shelf and try to boot them up, and they often won't. But the elephant in the room is that it's a matter of cultural priorities. It's not just a mystery or a technological inevitability. The corporations that are making the decisions about what formats are used are driven by profit. The fact that film disappears is not because it's impossible to keep making film, it's because there isn't enough money in it. And that, to me, is a decision that we should be making as a society. It should not be whether or not Sony makes enough profit that year that decides what the legacy of cinema is for human beings. And that is where the decision is coming down to. So really, you know, when we think about something like the Library of Congress and we think about something like a kind of cultural legacy that is collective, we have to decide whether we want the money to be made in terms of corporate profit or whether it's made in terms of some notion that these things are collectively important beyond profit. And it's really, you know, it's all a drop in the bucket compared to where money is being spent on something like the military. So it's not, again, it's not mystery, it's a decision.
Yeah, and all the decisions that are being made are the wrong ones.
Well, and Library of Congress doesn't do any preservation, they just make distinctions.
Yeah.
I mean, it's
But-
amazing, they don't really,
I mean, we have at the University of Georgia the third largest archive of radio and television in the world, and over 100,000 individual pieces. And so we're talking about preserving those. And, you know, it's in the quotes we've gotten are in the $15 to $20 million range. And that still doesn't solve the problem that digital does degrade and systems change. But I wanted to get to George before we open it up for questions. It's pretty much a change of topic, but your company handled the showing of Steve's documentary Life Itself at the Sundance Festival, right?
Yep.
I mean, maybe you could just quickly go through how the digital universe, it's kind of as a case study, how you use technology to do your job at a place like Sundance.
Well, I think, you know, with film festivals, and it's the same for a regular theatrical release too. I mean, you know, we're not, in the PR world, we're not necessarily content creators, but we help share the content and get it out there and spread the word. I think, you know, whereas you used to write a press release and send that out wide to the world in hopes that somebody would pick it up, you know, a lot of times now people are using social media just to get it out instantaneously, you know. Whether it's like a Vine video, digital content like that, or just news about a tour or a concert tour or whatever. So that's one interesting way that it's kind of, social media's kind of changed how we do things. And I know Steve specifically during Sundance employed a really interesting Indiegogo campaign to raise funds, you know, and that happened before the festival, and it allowed people who were contributors to see the film simultaneously with the Sundance Film Festival screening. And, you know, I think that kind of direct access is really interesting, and that's kind of changing the way whether people are raising funds on Kickstarter or Indiegogo. I think that's, you know, a big way that filmmakers are connecting directly with the audience and kind of cutting out the middleman a bit. And, you know, another thing that we do too, you know, there's all this, people want to see content way before a movie comes out at a festival or whenever. You know, clips become a big thing, you know, sending out an exclusive video clip from a film. Sometimes we'll send out one during a festival, but during the life of a theatrical campaign, it's almost become a bombardment, you know. I mean, there might be 6 to 10 clips from a film that get released before the film even comes out. You end up seeing the whole film pretty much before. There's no need to go see it in a theater, you know. Yeah. So I think, you know, there's a fine line with sending out just enough digital information and clips before a film comes out to kind of whet the audience's appetites before it just becomes overkill, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we're experiencing something like that at this festival. In an hour, we're going to be unveiling the statue of Roger in front of the Virginia Theater. The Associated Press, in 30 minutes, is going to do a story in which they have the exclusive photograph of the statue so that people can see it slightly before anybody else in the world can see it. But 30 seconds or 1 second after that exclusive photograph is released through the Associated Press, anybody else can pick up that photograph and show it. But, but because we've given them that exclusivity, it means that we get Associated Press coverage for that particular event. And this all has to do with technology, and there are moral and ethical questions to something as simple as that we don't have time to get into here. I'm going to throw it open for questions, so if you want to start lining up at the microphone, and okay, you can ask your question while they're all lining up.
The big strength that movie theaters have is they have a community right there. And yet, people come in, they watch the movie, and then they go home. I have friends over to watch movies in my house, and we have just a brief discussion. I think the great strength of our movie theaters would come if they regularly had discussions at the end of the movies. They had somebody come in and say, tell me what you think. What's it like for you? And even 15, 20 minutes, people get that sense of community, and they find things out about the film that they didn't realize in watching it the first time.
Yeah, more and more theaters are doing that. Anybody want to address that?
My favorite movie theater in Los Angeles, called the Cinefamily, they actually have a back patio, and it's encouraged to come before and after and talk about movies. And they are one of the only theaters I know that are very interested, that's why it's called Cinefamily, in creating a community. I think that's a great idea, though. More people should do that. But I think that this is all kind of stemming back to this bigger question, which I know you were at the panel earlier. It's like everyone wants to keep asking about what we do. It's like, well, create it yourself. The issue that we're coming to with all of this is that we're living our busy little lives, we're being little worker bees and allowing somebody else to be the queen bee, seeing everything that we're doing, and we don't get the perspective that others do. It's silly. We just are expecting that people that are in powerful positions behind a nice desk that are professionals know what they're doing, but the truth is they don't. We're the ones that are understanding it because we're directly in a room conversing, saying this is an issue, so let's fix it. I don't want to wait for somebody else to do it for me.
Yeah, so you're all empowered, okay? And you need to go home to your local art house cinema and demand that they actually have discussions after the films. Because if you talk to them, anything that brings more people into the theater, they're probably going to do. We have a long line, and we only have a few minutes, so if you could keep your questions and comments concise, we'd appreciate it.
Okay. This past weekend at Tribeca Film Festival, Joss Whedon showed a film. He premiered a film there, and then immediately after, it was up for sale on his site for video on demand for $5. I thought that was really interesting. I was wondering what your guys' general thoughts were on that, and if you see that as the future of distribution in the digital age.
I hope not.
Well, it's one future. Certainly, films have circulated lots of different ways for a very long time. A lot of it has to do with just the delay factor. When I was growing up, and I think some of the people here, you could see a Hollywood movie maybe 2 or 3 years after it opened on the Saturday night movie. So there you had to wait 3 years if you didn't want to pay your money at the theater the week it opened. But now you can see it 3 days later. To me, that's partly just another matter of this quantitative jump. It's very similar, but the actual changes in the quantity of things, how fast something can be done or how quickly it can be done, that really changes everything. So I think at one level you want to say everybody should have access to everything. We have a culture of superabundance. This is certainly the model we're sold, that the consumer is king and can demand anything on demand. But I think, to me, there's a virtue in waiting to see things under certain circumstances. It's like seeing it in an auditorium, as we've been talking about, with an audience. That's why I waited to see the film, Steve's film about Roger. I saw a bit of it on streaming, but I just decided I didn't want to have that kind of experience of that movie. But that's a choice that consumers are more and more demanding, and certainly As Jem has mentioned, corporations are in business to find ways to satisfy those kinds of demands.
Date distribution of films is going to become more and more, video on demand. This is, the future is here, and you're just going to see it more and more, whether we like it or not. In some instances, it's very good. For instance, I thought that the streaming, Life Itself, I think, was the first movie in Sundance's history to be seen at home the same night that it was shown at Sundance. And I think that Roger would have been tremendously exhilarated about that. One of the things about some people live in small towns, and some movies like Museum Hours or Short Term 12 may never make it to some small towns. So in the sense that if they had a film festival where you could get access to that and you could buy the movie for streaming afterwards, I'm in favor of that, so that more people can see really good things that may not make it otherwise.
There's
But
also.
Sorry, as a counter to that, the reason, you guys still have movie theaters here. Just those movies.
I live in a town like 10,000 people. This is my big vacation. You wouldn't, that's what the real world is like. I live in a town of 10,000 people. I drive an hour to an art house cinema.
Really?
So,
Yeah.
Yes.
That's pretty cool.
Not uncommon.
welcome to New Mexico.
Oh, well, my only argument against that is not across the board, but the movies that even in Los Angeles that are readily available to me are not necessarily an art film that I'm learning something. It's a movie that creates a big profit. And so I think it goes back to the same thing of where is the profit going? Where is that going in the end? That's all.
But let me just add a little different perspective on that, which is that, yes, corporations and distributors are doing day and date and things like that now, which has become a common part of the landscape. But there's also, in the independent film movement, filmmakers trying to kind of take control of their own distribution to some extent. And so I don't know what Josh Whedon is doing. He might not need to do this, but there are a lot of filmmakers who might do just exactly what he did, so that they can actually profit from their film instead of the distributor and all the middlemen. And so I think, there is no, I agree completely with your sentiments on this, but there is the realities of small towns. There's also the realities of filmmakers who are trying to engage in some level of self-distribution in the film business, much like people are doing in the music business now, because that model kind of crumbled. And so I don't begrudge any filmmaker. I'm sure he wants people to see it in the theater, but if there's a way for him to make money off of his own films so he can continue to make films and do it that way, all the power to him, in my view.
Because you're essentially using the film festival, whether it's Tribeca or Sundance, as your theatrical campaign, instead of waiting 6 months for a film to come out and all the traditional press and publicity that you're doing, you're using all the publicity and the press that's happening during the festival and all that added exposure as your quote-unquote theatrical campaign, so you have all that press and buzz leading up to the festival screening, and then you can have it made available on iTunes or VOD or whatever, So I think it makes sense for a lot of smaller films that would never open in a theater, So it just depends.
Can we have the next question, please?
I'll segue from what Steve was just saying and comment on something that Bree said, that it's up to us to help people connect the dots. Yesterday, there was a report in the New York Times that the FCC is going to make a proposed rule that will allow a fast lane, content providers to provide a fast lane if they pay more to get their film seen better. So for the independent filmmaker who doesn't have money, they are basically going to be screwed when that happens. So we need to help people understand that. So, how do we do that? How can we use our voices?
Well, there's Congress, right?
Good luck with that.
Well, and just support films that mean something, I think there's been so many great strides in independent film for these movies that were made for very little and were considered maybe up against the odds that in the end made a profit. And for a studio, if that's what's important, then, that's how the voices are heard in some ways.
And by the way, the person who made the comment at the microphone is Dan Aronson from Fandor.com. So he's trying to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And thank you, Fandor.com. Roger really, really had a lot of respect for your site.
And Fandor is a sponsor of the festival, but
But that's not why I said it.
Michael?
Yeah, I just like to bring a perspective from the third world because I come from the Philippines, and when it comes to digital, in the last 10 years, there's been an explosion of independent film, and it's been getting a lot of attention in that part of the world, and it would have never been possible to see these great films coming out of Southeast Asia if it weren't for digital. But it's such an irony because probably in the long term, as Barry Allen has mentioned, preservation of these films is down the drain. So in the past, probably in the 80s, you would see a lot of black and white films being shown on TV, but that has completely disappeared. And my suspicion is that the big studio companies who have never invested in film archiving in the Philippines have probably lost a lot of those films. So I was wondering, has there, if not in the US, has there been any model around the world that has successfully implemented some kind of solution for this problem?
You mean for the preservation of,
Yeah.
of digital?
Yeah,
in terms of archiving. Yeah.
The Europeans, particularly in Denmark, there was a conference there about 6 months ago about digital preservation, and the Europeans seem to be far ahead of anybody else in taking this seriously and doing something about it.
Because the last time I was in Saudi Arabia, I used to work there, and Egyptian films are huge. Anywhere in the Middle East, I used to notice there are so many black and white Egyptian films that are still being broadcast. I was wondering if they have an approach to that. Yeah, for Haifa.
There is a little bit of preservation, but it's a cultural issue.
Yeah.
Like when we come to the Middle East and third world in general, I think there is not a lot of, unfortunately, there is not a lot of value based on culture, on art and stuff like that. People, it's a very consumption-based society. So archival and heritage, and even like we have in Saudi Arabia in particular, we have amazing, like old, like not only film, it's like monuments that are gone because people don't appreciate history. People don't put, and a lot of, like even in Mecca where it is the holy place and it's they're supposed to preserve everything, they're demolishing like old houses to build Four Seasons, which are amazing Four Seasons, Saudi terms, but it is like, but there's a lot of culture, there is a lot of cultural loss where I come from, and it's a cultural thing, and there is more awareness now. People are more appreciative of art and culture and history, but it will take time to change how people think and preserve the world.
It was just something I wanted to highlight because digital seems to be educating a lot of people on film, and yet because of its spread, we might not have it for very long.
Right.
Yeah.
And I want to point
That's,
out that,
Mike-
I just want to point out that Michael Mirasol, Mirasol, is one of the far-flung correspondents. He does a lot of our really artistic, beautiful videos at RogerEbert.com. He has them other places too. He did one of our festival trailers. He took Roger's commentary from Dark City and made this beautiful, beautiful short video of it. So just remember that name when you go on RogerEbert.com and search Michael Mirasol, and you'll see some of his work.
And also, Michael did the trailer that we were running before every film in the film festival. That 1 minute thing you saw, that clip. And he did the one last year as well. Next question.
Hi, I also write for RogerEbert.com. I'm another one of the far-flung correspondents. And I just wrote an article, and it touches on a part of digital filmmaking that this panel hasn't actually touched on. And so I wanted to put the questions out. And the question is basically about the problem separating what is special effects and what is cinematography, and what seems to be a collapsing of those two categories at the Academy Awards. The last one being Gravity. The other one, which will probably be a hot topic, I think, this year, is what is acting, and is performance performance capture, as in the case of Andy Serkis when he's doing Caesar in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, or when he'll be reprising his role as Gollum in, I forget what the movie's name is, The Last Hobbit, which I know
Desolation
the
of
title
Smog.
just came out today, so I don't remember what it
Jana,
is.
can you step a little closer to the microphone so we can hear you?
So then it's a question about, is performance capture acting or is it special effects?
Bree?
So those two different topics.
I don't really believe in awards, so I'm not the person to ask.
No, but in terms of motion capture and acting through a digital recreation of
I
your...
mean, to be
or
honest
in-
with you, like when you see Nicolas Cage in movies, he gets like digital facelifts. So, like, I don't know. It doesn't. That stuff gets really, really blurred. I think that at the core of it, for me, I just don't know if the movies that you see are the movies that are readily available, which is what I was trying to get at from, I don't know, Girl Who Lives in New Mexico, is that, like, what is it, what is the honesty of this world and of this generation that we can bring and actually learn from, not the trickery. I think The Gravity is an interesting example because that movie gave us a rare opportunity to go to space in a world where we might not get to go to space or have an extra $500,000 to go up and see it. But that's personally where my interest lies, is what are the stories that we're telling? Why do we feel that they're important? And why is it that in a town where you have to drive an hour and a half to go see a movie, you could probably drive 10 minutes and hit like 20 McDonald's? Like, why is culture like that right now?
Yeah, that's a real question. But let's move on, Matt. Sorry to rush you, but we have to get to the unveiling of the statue on time.
I was wondering, there was a comment made earlier about the Library of Congress. Can anyone on the panel enlighten us what exactly is the Library of Congress's role, if any, in preservation of film? You know, because I think whenever that list of the induction into the Library of Congress is announced, a lot of people, including me, hear that and go, "Yay! Now the film is safe." But that's not necessarily the case. Can you kind of tell us what that is exactly?
And I have to tell you that this is Matt Zoller-Seitz, who is the editor-in-chief of RogerEbert.com.
Barry, you want to answer that?
Real quick, I've worked with the Library of Congress because they held a lot of our assets out of the Republic Library. They do make preservation elements. I don't think they publicize what they do as much as maybe some UCLA or some other archives, but they do stuff. It's much more kind of background than we know. Almost all of the archives get grants from Film Foundation. The money from the Golden Globes is given out to organizations like the Film Foundation and some others for them to give grants for specific titles. And David Packard has given a huge amount of money. We're talking about tens of millions of dollars to have modern archival facilities built to handle nitrate, because that really didn't exist until the last 7-8 years. The longest has been the Museum of Modern Art. But kind of behind the scenes and not very well publicized. I don't know at what level. They've got far more than they have got the funds and the facilities to preserve, but they do sometimes make things. When people make preservation elements, often that's not a story. It's got to be Lawrence of Arabia, $20 million worth of work to restore a damaged negative.
Well, I'm actually heartened to hear that, because in the case of Hoop Dreams, they did nothing that I know of. So
what is it, just a certificate?
It was more of a distinction, it seemed. I was surprised. There was the actual preservation of Hoop Dreams, and it had happened recently, and it happened through the UCLA Film Archive with Sundance and the Academy. The Library of Congress did nothing to preserve any elements that I know of. I mean, we were waiting for them to. But maybe we just slipped through the cracks. I mean, I'm actually, I mean, I'm not being facetious. I'm encouraged to hear
No,
that.
I think the problem is, none of the archives can get to the stuff that they would like to.
No, they never even asked, though. So, but I do want to make one point, which is that the preservation of film, as on film, was in a very, very sorry state before digital came along. I mean, very, very few films are preserved. The elements are set up for it, like you were saying, which is great. But we had a pretty woeful track record on preservation of films beyond the sort of usual suspects in this culture, going back not just to nitrate, but even after that. So it's made harder, I think, now by digital because of the migration problem. It's like, you know, and technology, and absolutely, but it's not like we were doing a great job of it and digital came along and now we're in trouble.
No, it also has to be said again, there's a profit motive, because the studios did not typically preserve most of their material, except when DVD became available, suddenly there was a market for the libraries. And so there were a lot of studios, I can't speak for Paramount, but a lot of studios embarked on more ambitious preservation projects because they had a new market for selling older titles, and then, of course, current titles as well. So there was a kind of effort to preserve those.
Yeah, and we benefited from that here at the festival in that when Paramount, for example, remastered something for digital, they usually made a new archival 35 millimeter print that we would then secure for the festival.
And now, you know, we must break off because we have to get over to the unveiling of the sculpture of Roger in front of the Virginia Theater.
Yeah. So please all make your way to the Virginia Theater, and thank you to the panel.